Passive voice is very common in science. It's very common in science because often it's not the person, it's not the doer of the action that matters. It's the process or it's the action itself. Let's take a look at two examples. The first example is a process. Here we're looking at a process of what happens to used fluorescent lamps, how they're recycled. And the process is kind of complicated, so maybe a student will be describing this process. Now, because the doers of the action aren't important, the use of passive voice will be necessary. And if you notice from the yellow highlights, there's a lot of passive voice in this text. Let's take a look at some examples. Here's the introduction. It just says, the recycling of used fluorescent lamps is an interesting and important process. Firstly, the used fluorescent lamps are placed in the bin and crushed. After this, they are separated into three separate parts: metal, glass, mercury, and phosphor powder. Now, as you can see, there's passive voice, are placed. To be verb with past participle. They are placed in the bin and crushed. Notice that this word crushed, this verb, this past participle verb, is connected to this to be verb. So the lamps are placed in the bin and crushed. After this, they are separated. So what we're dealing with here is simple present tense, passive voice, and of course the ed is required as the past participle. Let's continue on just a little bit. However, the metal and glass are recycled, making way for similar products. Now, who did the recycling? Doesn't matter. We don't know, we don't care, or maybe it's obvious. But the point is that we leave out who did the action, and passive voice is how it's done. Then, the phosphor powder and metallic mercury go through a process where the chemicals are separated. The powder can be reused, and the mercury can be processed. Now, here are two different types of passive voice. Before, we were using simple present. Now we're using the modal form with can. The powder can be reused, and the mercury can be processed. Who's going to do this processing? Who's going to do the reusing? We don't know, we don't care, or it's obvious. Then they go on and say, in the triple distillation method. After this triple distillation procedure, the mercury is cleaned and can be reused. Again, there's a lot of passive voice because the focus is on the process, not on the people who do the process. Another example of passive voice in scientific writing is sometimes students write reports on lab experiments or other activities where the doer of the action is obvious. It's the student. So passive voice is a really good choice here. For example, in the first part of the experiment, 30 grams of chlorine were placed in the beaker. Then 20 grams of phosphorus were added. Now imagine that this report continues. There's going to be a lot of passive voice because the professor or the teacher who is reading it knows exactly who did it. It's you, the student. So if we were to write this and say, in the first part of the experiment, I added 30 grams of chlorine in the beaker, then I added this, then I added this, then I did this, I, and it would get very repetitive and it wouldn't be pleasant to read. So passive voice is an excellent tool in circumstances like this. Okay, I hope this helps. Thank you very much.